Welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. This is web editor Nicole Raleigh, and today I have with me Jason Bock, co-founder and CEO of CTMC, a company that operates at the intersection of the cutting-edge biopharmaceutical manufacturing technology of resilience and cancer innovation of the MD Anderson Cancer Center. A first-of-its-kind cell therapy engine, CTMC aims to advance novel scientific breakthroughs into medicines developed rapidly and robustly to, ultimately, end cancer. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you so much, Nicole.
So, unique patient-focused manufacturing models are needed to scale up innovative cell therapies for cancer, and CTMC is challenging the status quo to achieve this and get them to patients. Jason, firstly, tell me about your journey to co-founding CTMC and provide, please, if you will, some general details on the work that the company is doing in the personalized cell therapy space.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I've had around now a 25-year career developing novel therapies and finding ways of bringing them to patients. The first 20 years or so was in small, medium, and large-size biotech and biopharma, where we developed novel therapies. I was involved in bringing more than 20 products into clinical testing, through IND into clinical testing, and then personally leading 3 of those through to global commercialization with peak market sales of over $3.5 billion. Then about 5 years ago, there was an interesting convergence where I saw the first commercial CAR T therapies had been approved, and yet there's seeming a big gap in the CMC, the development and the manufacturing of these products, and that the challenges needed to be overcome to get these life-changing products to as many patients as we could. And I had the good fortune of seeing and participating in the monoclonal antibody field developing over the course of my 20-year career, and saw many parallels with cell therapy for the early stages of monoclonal antibodies, like I said, 20 or 30 years ago. And taking that into account with also the differences that cell therapies, especially autologous cell therapies, bring in terms of the starting material for these therapies coming directly from patients, and then manufacturing single-dose batches that would be then delivered back to that same patient as a single dose with curative intent. And so I was really intrigued if we could think about this challenge from a different way, then take some of the learnings we had from monoclonal antibody field, but what are some of the differences, and come up with a fit-for-purpose solution. And so I had this opportunity through sort of coincidences to be interacting with leaders at MD Anderson. And we decided to try and to put together something, I think, very novel in terms of having a group associated with the leading cancer care institute literally in the world, but doing that doing the development of these products in a very industrial way, like biopharma or biotech. And what we had seen is, both ends of the spectrum. So there had been academic medical centers who had been manufacturing cell therapies for a decade or two. MD Anderson was doing that, but in a very academic approach, which made sense because they were academic institutions. And then there were more traditional manufacturers trying to do that, in a purely like CMO type approach, contract manufacturing. I saw the opportunity to sort of do something novel in bringing those two together. So I was really gratified that we were able to put together this joint venture between National Resilience and MD Anderson, where we could bring together industrial manufacturing and development capabilities, but very tightly connected to a leading academic medical center.
Thank you, Jason. So, needless to say, or rather to put it gently, that's really taken off in just 18 months as well, because CTMC over those 18 months has pushed 7 therapies into clinical trials. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about that, but also possibly discuss the promise, so to speak, that these cell therapies hold for cancer treatment.
Let me if I could start with your second point, because I think that's what makes everything else worthwhile. I think these treatments are remarkable in terms of their efficacy and the just very different nature of them being single dose treatments with curative intent. Before I got more deeply into cancer treatment, I figured sort of every treatment was with curative intent. But it turns out that a lot of cancer treatments we know extend life, can push back the cancer, but almost every patient recurs in giving some of those kind of very targeted chemotherapy type treatments. What's novel about immunotherapy, whether it's checkpoint inhibitor, but even more so cell therapy, is that a large fraction of the patients are cured. The best example of this, or at least the most gripping example, is Emily Whitehead, who was the first pediatric patient treated with a CAR T therapy when she was 6 years old. She went through various lines of treatment, and she failed those treatments failed her when she was around 5 years old. And the cancer was riddled throughout her body, and her parents were basically told to take her and put her in hospice. Another amazing coincidence was that a CAR T therapy clinical trial had just opened up 2 weeks previous to that. They were able to get Emily on that treatment. They manufactured her CAR T cells. She had a very severe reaction to those, was in a coma for several days to a week. Came out of that. When she went through her scan a month later, the doctors could no longer detect the cancer in her body. And that was the only treatment she has been given for the last 12 years. She's now a sophomore in college and has her whole life in front of her from that single treatment. And so I think, that's why I think it's important to that's an amazing story. I mean,
Absolutely.
And yet there are these tremendous challenges with developing a personalized therapy, an individualized therapy, single dose therapy, on the manufacturing, on the regulatory side. How do you control these? How do we scale them up? How do we make them as accessible and affordable to as many patients as we can? But the reason we think about that, the reason, I moved down to Houston to start this whole new thing was because of that tremendous potential. Okay, after that long talk, I couldn't remember what the first part of your question was.
That's okay. Before we move back to the first part, which is about CTMC's 7 therapies at the moment in clinical trials in just 18 months, I just want to focus on what seems to be a running theme is this series of coincidences, and maybe have listeners consider when is a coincidence not a coincidence, but just the right time. So going back to the first part of the question, Jason, tell us more about the 7 therapies that CTMC has pushed into clinical trials.
Yeah, so we have a really interesting model for working both with MD Anderson researchers who have researched and come up with individual therapies, and then needed an industrial vehicle for bringing those into the clinic. But interestingly as well, having very creative partnerships with biotech companies who, again, have done similar things, developed a product, have shown powerful preclinical proof of concept, but now we need a way of bringing that into the clinic. And, this is for other modalities, this is, what's commonly done. That's almost why the entire biotech industry was created, to take research projects, turn them into industrial therapeutics, and bring them into clinical testing. But there's several unique challenges with cell therapy that make this a tougher lift for biotech companies, in that the very complicated supply chain that you need to go through, and that network of different suppliers, and the number of clinical sites that you need to bring online, coordinating the logistics of that on a patient-by-patient basis is very laborious and complicated, and a very big lift for new biotech companies. Whereas because of our positioning closely associated with MD Anderson, that's what we do every day, is we're talking with the MD Anderson clinicians. They're enrolling patients on clinical trials and coordinating with us on the logistics of bringing the starting material here to the manufacturing facility and us producing those batches and getting them back to the patients. In fact, because this is a podcast you can't quite see, but right behind me in the window you can see MD Anderson Cancer Center, which is just 2 blocks away from us. We can basically almost walk therapies over to the clinic. And so that close physical proximity, as well as connectedness in terms of the organizations, have allowed us this unique model of providing access to industrial manufacturing and thorough and scientifically driven clinical studies, so that a company can have we can support doing all the activities needed to take them from preclinical proof of concept through to, say, 15, 20, 25 patients of clinical data to really see how their therapy performs in patients. And the other thing that I would say is a difference with cell therapy, because these treatments are so powerful and personalized and are living drugs that can expand in the body, oftentimes very early in clinical studies, you can see efficacy results. Unlike small molecules and antibodies, where typically you have to go through numerous cohorts of dose escalation and multiple dose cohorts before you can really start to assess efficacy, we can often see efficacy in cell therapies in the first 10 or 15 patients.
Thank you, Jason. So for those listeners who were questioning whether MD Anderson Center is really behind you 2 blocks away, it isn't a screen. I can see this as well. This might be an audio podcast, but we are video to video at the moment. So if we really tunnel down into CTMC's model now, Jason, firstly, can you tell listeners why a patient-adjacent manufacturing model is absolutely crucial when it comes to developing these personalised therapies? I assume it is all to do with these living cells and time around that.
Yeah, exactly, Nicole. So it's a combination of their living cells, and so we need to move very quickly, as well as the patients who typically get these treatments are quite advanced cancer patients. And so they literally don't have very much time. And so saving days in terms of shipping is important. And I think, so that's important on a patient by patient basis. But in therapeutics development, if we zoom out, what's important as well is that all these pieces that have to come together to bring a product to IND or to initiate a clinical study or to treat patients, all need to come together. And what we've been able to do is aggregate many of these critical activities, and in doing so, been able to remove a lot of white space in overall development programs. So as you kindly mentioned, number of INDs we've cleared in the last 18 months and 2 years since we spun out. What's been very appealing to biotech companies and what we pride ourselves on is coming up with a model that really shortens the amount of time it takes us, not only for one particular patient batch, but the amount of time it takes overall for a project to get from preclinical proof of concept to dosing patients. So for example, due to our tight connection with MD Anderson, and they have done a lot of innovative things on the clinical trial startup. And so for most trials that go on at MD Anderson, it can take upwards of 6 months or longer to activate that site to start enrolling patients. But because we have such a defined relationship with them, because now we've done this a number of times, we're able to activate MD Anderson as a clinical site almost always within less than 100 days from when we file the IND. And so saving that 3 months or more falls right to the, if you will, the bottom line of how long it takes for these therapies to be developed and for us to understand how well they work in patients. So a big part of, and we've tried to optimize almost every part of this spectrum of activities to focus on speed, reducing risk, and in many ways, we've been able to reduce overall cost as well. So I think it's one of these unique situations where you're able to have all these different aspects because of the different way we've come up with the business model of doing things. And you actually are able to do things quicker with less risk. And if you're comprehensive about how you look at costs, overall less costs.
Thank you, Jason, for providing that sort of overview of the CTMC model and how it accelerates the product to patient more efficiently. So if we focus on the patients now, we turn to patient centricity. Can you tell us how patient-centric approaches streamline these manufacturing processes, improving efficacy and permitting a personalised treatment approach, especially when that supply chain, as you've been discussing, is local?
It's been interesting that we've seen over the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years, especially, a very large, let's say, evaluation of personalized therapies that we call autologous, where we start with the patient's own cells, versus allogeneic approaches, where we may start with the donor cells and be able to give those to different patients. And so far, what we've seen is, unfortunately, fairly disappointing results with allogeneic therapies, where it turns out the immune system is really, really good at detecting other people's cells and rejecting those very quickly before they have a chance to attack the cancer. On the other hand, we've seen very strong scientific data for these autologous cell therapies that persist long enough to see durable responses. And while these treatments initially began and focused on heme malignancies, blood cancers like leukemia and lymphoma, subsequently new therapies have been developed and approved this year for solid tumors. One from Iovance as a TIL therapy approved in melanoma, and another TCRT from Adaptimmune for a solid tumor. And so these are autologous treatments now approved for solid tumors, which represent 90% of all cancers. And so while we all want the field to advance more rapidly, I think when we zoom out, we are making very strong progress in expanding indications that cell therapies can be utilized in. To be honest, most of the progress has been with autologous therapies.
Thank you, Jason.
The challenge then really continues, the spotlight continues to be on those supply chains and manufacturing practices to improve those, because the thesis was, hey, with allogeneic, we get away from a lot of those personalized supply chain problems, but the issue is we haven't seen the efficacy. And so we see the efficacy in autologous, and so we just need to continue to redouble our efforts on innovations in development and manufacturing of autologous treatments.
Well, you've preempted my final question of this conversation, Jason. I was going to say we've been talking a lot about progress, but you quite rightly switched to the remaining challenges there. So I just wondered if you wanted to add anything else to this close to the conversation, maybe a positive thought for our listeners as we go our separate ways.
Okay, sure. Overall, this is a very new approach for all of pharmaceutical development to have individualized, personalized treatments. And it's really hard. It's really hard to figure out control processes where your starting material comes from different patients every time, and yet to have really robust processes that reproducibly generate consistent therapies. On the other hand, what I would say is many of the challenges that lie before us now were similar to challenges in, say, the 1990s and early 2000s with monoclonal antibodies, where we thought these therapies are the most expensive we've ever developed. Will the healthcare system be able to support them? How can we actually, these products are so much bigger and so much more complicated than small molecule treatments. We have to grow them in living cells that secrete them. How are we going to be able to do this? And you know what? Over the course of 20 or 30 years, we did it. We worked really hard. It was really complicated. There were a multitude of incremental and some step changes that enabled monoclonal antibodies to become like a mainstay in not only cancer treatment, but all of healthcare. And so I'm 100% confident that we will get there. Do we know exactly what that path is? But I think if we keep our mind minds open to new ways of approaching it, really coming up with fit-for-purpose solutions. And I'll tie it back to something you said earlier about coincidences and opportunities. I think what's important is that, we have like let's call it like a North Star of a direction we're going in, but that we keep our eyes wide open to opportunities as they present ourselves and be able to take advantage of those opportunities. Just like the Whiteheads very understandably could have, when they got the news of that their daughter should go on hospice, could have very understandably just like turned inward and brought their daughter home. They looked for new opportunities and happened to find one with a new clinical study. I think as an industry, we need to have that same kind of eyes wide open, looking for different ways of doing things, different kinds of collaborations, different ways of sharing information, and having a vision of pushing the entire field forward. That's really how we've designed, engineered, intentionally thought about putting CTMC together. And while we're extremely proud of those 7 products that are in clinical testing, I also hope that we've stimulated thinking across the field about better ways of accelerating these therapies reaching the most patients they can.
Yes, as you say, it's been hard work, but with hard work comes vital progress and innovation. Thank you, Jason. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Nicole.
So that concludes another episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about previous installments at pharmaphorum.com/podcasts. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon Music, Podbean, and pretty much wherever you get your other podcasts. Just search for pharmaphorum and press subscribe. Of course, don't forget to visit our website itself, where you can sign up for daily and weekly news and analysis bulletins. And do follow us as well on X or Twitter and LinkedIn at pharmaphorum. That's all for now. Thank you for listening.